On a quiet morning in early March of 1989, in the rural stretches of Berkeley County, South Carolina, the day began like any other in the Turner household. 5-year-old Justin Lee Turner, a bright, cheerful boy whose blond hair and warm smile made him instantly recognizable to neighbors and family members alike, started his morning routine with a bowl of Cinnamon Crunch cereal. It was a simple ritual, one that marked the beginning of another day he was expected to spend at Whitesville Elementary School, where he attended kindergarten. Justin lived with his biological father, Victor Turner, and his stepmother, Pamela Turner, in a rural neighborhood near the small community of Monk's Corner. Their home stood among open fields, wooded patches, and widely spaced country houses, a place where neighbors knew each other by name and where families believed their children could still walk to a bus stop safely. Justin's mornings nearly always followed the same pattern. After breakfast, he would put on his clothes for school, gather whatever he needed for the day, and walk a short path from the Turner residence to the driveway of a nearby neighbor. From that spot, a school bus would take him and several other children to Whitesville Elementary. It was a routine so ordinary, so predictable, that no one could have imagined how quickly it would fracture into confusion and alarm. But on that morning, Friday, March 3rd, 1989, Justin's routine broke without warning. As the school bus doors opened at the neighbor's driveway, the children stepped aboard one by one. Some were still waking up, rubbing sleep out of their eyes, while others chattered excitedly about the day ahead. But Justin didn't appear. He wasn't on the driveway. He wasn't on the path approaching the bus stop. He was simply not there. Those on the bus initially assumed that Justin must have been sick or kept home by his stepmother. It wasn't unusual for a child to miss a day due to a cold or morning fever. Nothing at first seemed out of the ordinary, but as the day unfolded at Whitesville Elementary, Justin's friends began to notice that his desk remained empty, his voice absent from their usual conversations, and his small figure nowhere to be seen on the playground. The assumption that he was home ill dissolved entirely when the afternoon bus returned to the neighborhood. As the vehicle slowed to its usual stop near the Turner property, Justin's stepmother, Pamela, came out to greet him, expecting to see the familiar blonde head among the crowd of children stepping off. Instead, she watched as child after child exited the bus without Justin among them. Confusion turned rapidly to panic. Pamela immediately questioned the driver and the children. They all gave the same answer. Justin had not boarded the bus that morning. From that moment, the alarm was raised. Pamela contacted neighbors asking whether anyone had seen Justin. She then reported his disappearance, setting into motion a desperate search that would grip Berkeley County for decades. One of Justin's older cousins later recalled that Friday afternoon vividly: the shock, the fear, and the sudden shift in atmosphere when Pamela arrived asking if they had seen her stepson. What had begun as a typical day shattered into a nightmare no one could fully comprehend. The possibility of illness, or of Justin wandering off on his own, evaporated instantly. Something was deeply wrong, and within hours the community knew it. Law enforcement officers, family members, and neighbors gathered quickly to search the area around the Turner property. Deputies James Gaither and Philip Mason were among the first to respond. They swept through the house, the surrounding land, and every structure on the property, including a travel camper that sat near the home. That camper would later become the most haunting symbol in the case, but at that moment, officers found nothing. No footprints leading away from the path, no signs of a struggle, and no indication that Justin had attempted to walk anywhere except towards the neighbor's house as he always had. The sheriff's office brought in more personnel, volunteers, and eventually search and rescue teams. They combed through brush, fields, ditches, and wooded terrain in methodical grid patterns. Helicopters scanned from above, and ponds were dredged for any sign of the missing boy. With each hour that passed, the fear weighing on Justin's loved ones grew heavier. The idea that he might have simply wandered off became more improbable. The reality sinking in was something far darker. The disappearance of Justin Turner was not just a missing child report. It became a community tragedy. Many who had known Justin personally described him as a sweet, gentle, and loving child who showed no history of running away, fearlessness toward strangers, or behavioral issues. He was a trusting boy, one who could easily feel safe around familiar faces. That, investigators later said, might have been the key element in what happened. Behind the happy demeanor that Justin displayed, however, lay a complicated family history. Justin was born in 1983 to Vivian Elaine Pace and Victor Turner. Their marriage had been troubled from its early days. By the mid 1980s, tensions and conflicts had led to separation and eventually divorce. Victor was awarded primary custody of Justin, while Elaine remained a devoted mother who maintained contact with her son through weekend visits and daily phone calls. She fought to remain part of his life even as custody arrangements weighed heavily on everyone involved. When Justin disappeared, one of the earliest concerns was whether Elaine might have attempted to take her son back without permission, a scenario often considered in custodial conflict cases, but detectives quickly ruled out that possibility. Elaine and her husband, Russell Pace, were confirmed to be at their workplaces that day. In fact, when Elaine's family received word that Justin had not come home from school, they were devastated, frantic, and desperate for answers. Elaine repeatedly pleaded with authorities, insisting that she had no involvement and begging them to find her son. Her heartbreak echoed for decades, long after her own passing. As the hours stretched into days, the search intensified. On Sunday, March 5th, 2 days after Justin vanished, more than 100 individuals joined the effort to scour every inch of the Turner property. Family members, volunteers, trained teams, and officers gathered in coordinated sweeps. The tension in the air was suffocating. Many feared the worst, but hoped against all hope that Justin would be found alive. That hope ended abruptly when Justin's father, Victor Turner, made a discovery that would haunt investigators and the community forever. On the third day of searching, Victor entered the travel camper that officers claimed had been thoroughly checked earlier. Within seconds, according to investigative reports, Victor called out an alarm. Inside a storage compartment, Justin's lifeless body was found. The discovery stunned everyone present. It was not only the unbearable tragedy of the moment, nor the realization that Justin's young life had ended in a brutal act of violence. It was the inexplicable fact that multiple individuals, including deputies, family members, and neighbors, had searched that same camper before and claimed to have seen nothing. Justin had been strangled. The child had also suffered violation, though investigators made clear that there was no evidence of ongoing abuse prior to his death. His small hand clutched a piece of animal hair, a detail that later became part of the forensic investigation. The condition of his body left detectives deeply troubled. Many reported that Justin's skin felt colder than would be expected for the climate and timeline, leading to early speculation that his body might have been refrigerated before being placed in the camper. This theory, however, would later be disputed by forensic experts. What could not be disputed was the horror of what had occurred. The rural community, shaken to its foundation, found itself grappling with fear and grief. Parents who once felt comfortable letting their children play in their front yards now watched them with renewed vigilance. Neighbors locked their doors more frequently, uneasy with the idea that someone capable of harming a child might be living among them. Investigators found themselves faced with a case riddled with questions. How had the body appeared in a location previously searched? Who could have placed Justin there without detection? Was the crime committed by a stranger who crossed into the community unnoticed, or by someone much closer to the family? Criminal psychology experts later suggested that the likelihood of a stranger committing the crime was low. The act of taking Justin undetected, killing him, and then concealing his body in a location familiar to the household strongly pointed toward someone who knew the family and possibly lived with them. Still at the time, investigators pursued all possible leads. Attention soon shifted back to the Turner household. Pamela and Victor both provided statements and underwent polygraph examinations, yet the information they gave to investigators was inconsistent. Early in the investigation, Pamela claimed that Justin had gotten ready for school and walked toward the bus stop as usual while she was in the shower, but later inquiries revealed that Justin never boarded the bus at all. This contradiction became a central focus for law enforcement. Complicating matters further, both Victor and Pamela failed their polygraph tests. Days afterward, they declined further communication with investigators and retained an attorney, deepening the already growing suspicion around them. As more discrepancies emerged, the family faces became increasingly scrutinized. Despite these suspicions, however, clear evidence did not immediately surface. Investigators, unsure of the sequence of events and lacking conclusive forensic connections, struggled to move forward with charges. Pamela was eventually arrested years later when a jury recommended a warrant for homicide, yet the charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence. The years stretched into decades, marked by heartbreak, frustration, and the unyielding determination of Justin's biological mother, Elaine, and her extended family. Though Elaine passed away in 2004, she spent 15 years fighting for answers, never once losing sight of her belief that her son deserved justice. The case turned cold, yet it was never forgotten. Over the decades that followed, advances in forensic technology began to break open long dormant cases across the United States. In 2020, the Berkeley County Sheriff's Office established a dedicated cold case team revisiting 9 unsolved homicides, including Justin's. It was this renewed effort and the evolution of forensic science that finally began to unravel the truth behind what had happened to 5-year-old Justin Turner. The cold case team uncovered new forensic connections, fibers found on Justin's neck, and clothing that matched items located in the Turner household, the placement of Justin's body inside the camper in a location that required familiarity with the structure, pointed again toward those who lived in the home. A search affidavit also highlighted the detail that Victor had discovered Justin's body within seconds of entering the camper, a fact that raised significant doubts about earlier claims that the space had been thoroughly searched. In April of 2021, more than 30 years after the crime, this evidence provided the breakthrough investigators had long awaited. By January of 2024, Victor Turner and Megan Turner, formerly Pamela, were arrested and charged with the murder of Justin Lee Turner. Though the legal proceedings remain ongoing, and though defense attorneys have introduced new theories including claims of possible involvement by an unrelated serial offender, the core forensic evidence remains focused on the Turner household. For Justin's relatives on his mother's side, the arrests were bittersweet, relief intertwined with mourning, as many expressed sorrow that Elaine did not live long enough to witness the progress she had fought for so passionately. Through all of this, the efforts of Justin's cousin, Amy Parsons, sustained public awareness. As a child of 8 at the time of the murder, she grew into one of the strongest advocates for justice in the case, creating online platforms, engaging with law enforcement, and reminding the world of a little boy whose life was taken too soon. In the days that followed the discovery of 5-year-old Justin Lee Turner's body, Berkeley County became a landscape of quiet grief, whispered questions, and deepening suspicion. Though investigators maintained a professional tone, the case immediately took on the weight of something far more complicated than a typical missing child investigation: the discovery of Justin's body inside a camper on the Turner property, a space that had supposedly been searched multiple times, raised concerns that haunted every deputy involved. The shock among law enforcement was apparent from the beginning, and the uncertainty of how the body had remained undetected demonstrated the fragile nature of the earliest hours of the investigation. As news of the tragedy spread across Moncks Corner and surrounding communities, families who had once believed their children were safe in rural neighborhoods now reconsidered every assumption. In a part of South Carolina where generations of families lived minutes from each other, where children played in front yards and neighbors waved from porches, the vulnerability exposed by Justin's death unsettled nearly everyone. Fear crept in quietly. Parents kept their children inside. Teachers at Whitesville Elementary struggled to explain Justin's absence to classmates who could barely grasp what had happened. Communities held prayer gatherings, searching for comfort, hoping that answers would soon emerge. Investigators faced pressure from both the public and the media to determine who had taken Justin's life. The earliest theory involved the possibility of an unknown intruder abducting Justin on his short walk from his home to the neighbor's driveway, but nothing on the property indicated such a scenario. There were no signs of forced entry, no unusual footprints, and no eyewitnesses reporting unfamiliar individuals in the area. The absence of evidence supporting an outsider's involvement gradually narrowed the focus inward toward those closest to the child. While this shift occurred behind the scenes, tensions within the extended family were building. Justin's biological mother, Elaine Pace, was devastated and frantic. She drove from her home in Somerville to Berkeley County the day she received the call, accompanied by her father and her husband. According to the accounts of those who were there, Elaine was inconsolable. She pleaded with investigators repeatedly, insisting she had not taken her son and demanding that authorities continue searching until they found him. At that point, before Justin's body was discovered, Elaine was already terrified that her worst fear would be realized. The accusations directed toward her during the earliest hours left lasting emotional scars. As the investigation evolved, Elaine remained outspoken about her desire for justice and her frustration with the inconsistencies surrounding the case. Following Justin's body being found, investigators interviewed the Turners in greater detail. Pamela Turner, who later changed her name to Megan, repeated her initial version of events: that Justin left the house shortly after breakfast, that she took a shower, and that she didn't realize anything was wrong until the school bus returned without him. This timeline quickly came under scrutiny. For investigators, it was difficult to reconcile Pamela's account with the fact that no one else had seen Justin at the bus stop. More troubling was that some reports suggested a confrontation or argument may have taken place between Pamela and Justin that morning, contradicting the calm and uneventful story she originally described. Victor Turner's account also raised red flags. He insisted he had been at work as a pipe welder during the time Justin went missing, yet his emotional reactions, or lack thereof, during key stages of the investigation unsettled many who interacted with him. Some investigators noted that Victor showed noticeable nervousness at the crime scene. At one point, he even asked a deputy what would happen if someone in the family had harmed the child. That question lingered heavily in the minds of those nearby, not only because of its content, but because of the timing. Justin's body had just been found. Emotions were expected to be raw, but this phrasing seemed to carry a different weight, a hypothetical with unsettling implications. Despite the suspicions circulating among both investigators and members of the community, law enforcement still lacked the forensic technology needed to definitively tie any individual to the crime. The late 1980s were a time when DNA evidence was still in its infancy, and fiber analysis, while useful, could not deliver the same level of precision available in later decades. Crime scene preservation was also compromised by the number of individuals who had walked through the property during the early searches. Well-meaning volunteers, family members, and even some officers had unintentionally created challenges that would follow investigators for years. The discovery that Deputy Philip Mason failed a polygraph test regarding his claim that he had previously searched the camper added even more confusion. Some speculated whether the search had been rushed or careless. Others wondered if the body had been placed in the camper after initial searches. The conflicting statements from multiple people, Deputy Mason, Justin's grandmother, and a neighbor, all of whom claimed to have checked the camper, introduced a puzzle that no one could solve. If all three were telling the truth, how had Justin's body gone unnoticed? The possibility that the body was moved after Justin had died became a difficult but necessary theory. Certain aspects of the condition of Justin's body created further questions. Some reported that the child's skin felt unusually cool given the mild weather. A cold body in a warm climate led early investigators to wonder if Justin had been stored somewhere else before being placed inside the camper. While forensic experts later determined that the refrigeration theory was unlikely, the question reflected the deep uncertainty investigators faced in those first traumatic days. The autopsy report narrowed Justin's time of death to somewhere between late morning and early afternoon, based on the presence of food in his stomach. Though this window was not exact, it conflicted sharply with the idea that Justin had even begun his journey to school. If he died between mid-morning and midday, it further supported the theory that his death occurred at home or extremely close to it. And if his death occurred so soon after he was last known alive, the chances that a stranger had abducted him in such a narrow time frame became increasingly improbable. The challenges of the investigation extended into the early 1990s. A 6-year-old child came forward claiming to have seen Justin being abducted the morning he disappeared, but when investigators interviewed him, they realized his story was inconsistent and likely influenced by hearing adults discuss the case. Without reliable eyewitnesses, the investigation remained at a standstill, and over time, the community grew quieter about the case, but no one ever truly forgot. Justin's mother, Elaine, dedicated the remainder of her life to pushing for justice. She contacted investigators regularly. She attended meetings. She participated in media interviews whenever possible. The grief she carried remained raw, and her heartbreak was visible to anyone who knew her. According to those close to her, Elaine's determination came from a deep sense of maternal responsibility. She believed she owed her son the truth, even if that truth was devastating. Elaine passed away in 2004, having fought for 15 years without seeing a resolution, but before her death, she asked her husband, Russell, to continue the fight. He promised her he would never stop, and he kept his word. 2 decades after the investigation first stalled, new life emerged in the case. In 2020, the Berkeley County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit revisited several unresolved homicides. Technological advancements made it possible to analyze older evidence with far greater accuracy than was available in the 1980s or 90s. For Justin's family, this renewed investigation felt like a long awaited turning point. The cold case team consisted of a full time investigator and 2 volunteers, each bringing a fresh perspective to the decades old files. The more they studied the evidence, the more they realized that older forensic samples held untapped potential. With modern testing methods, fiber evidence could reveal more specific matches. Biological materials that had once been considered inconclusive could now be examined with far greater sensitivity. Among the most significant breakthroughs came from fibers located on Justin's neck and clothing. These fibers matched items from the Turner household. While fiber evidence alone cannot always prove guilt, in combination with the circumstances, the placement of the body, the narrow time frame of the crime, and the lack of evidence supporting outside involvement, it became a powerful piece of the puzzle. The placement of Justin's body in a hidden part of the camper was also reevaluated. Investigators noted that the compartment where Justin was found was not obvious or easily accessed by someone unfamiliar with the vehicle. It was the kind of hidden space that required knowledge of the camper's layout, a detail that heavily implicated those living in the home. The affidavit noted that Victor Turner had discovered Justin's body in mere seconds upon entering the camper. This contradicted earlier claims that the camper had been searched thoroughly, raising questions about how Victor knew exactly where to look. After months of reviewing evidence, investigators felt confident that the case was solvable. In April of 2021, they prepared the findings for prosecutors. It took time, nearly 3 years of follow-up testing, legal review, and the careful assembly of every puzzle piece. But on January 9th, 2024, Berkeley County authorities made the arrests that many had long anticipated. Victor Turner and Megan Turner were taken into custody and charged with 1 count of murder each. After 35 years, the case had shifted from unsolved tragedy to active prosecution. For Justin's maternal relatives, the moment was overwhelming. His cousin Amy Parsons, who was 8 years old when Justin was killed, broke down when she heard the news. She had spent decades advocating on Justin's behalf, running the Justice for Justin Lee Turner page, contacting investigators, and refusing to let the case fade into obscurity. To her, the arrests were both a victory and a reminder of the years of pain endured by the family. Following their arrests, Victor and Megan appeared before the court. Both were granted bond, set at $50,000 each, and were ordered not to leave the state or contact Justin's maternal relatives. The prosecution and defense teams then began preparing for trial. While prosecutors pointed to fiber evidence and inconsistencies in the Turners' accounts, the defense sought to introduce a new theory that a serial killer named Richard Mark Avett might have been involved in Justin's death. This claim required careful examination from investigators. Serial offender involvement is rare, particularly in cases involving children killed inside their own homes. Prosecutors requested additional time to evaluate the defense's evidence, leading the judge to delay the proceedings. One of the prosecution's central arguments involved a dog leash found within the Turner residence. Forensic examiners suggested it may have been used in Justin's strangulation, though defense experts argued that a dog collar could not be ruled out. The uncertainty surrounding the specifics of the ligature did not weaken the prosecution's broader narrative that the forensic evidence pointed undeniably toward the Turners. As the case continued through the judicial process, the emotional impact on Justin's family remained profound. One of the most passionate voices was that of Amy Parsons, who addressed the Turners publicly, expressing the pain that had gripped the family for decades. She emphasized that Victor and Megan had lived freely for more than 30 years, while Justin had lost everything the moment his life was taken. To Amy and to those who loved Justin, justice was long overdue. She spoke on behalf of the family, reminding the Turners that every day they lived without consequence was another day stolen from Justin's memory. Through all of this, Justin's story continued to resonate with the community. Local newspapers revisited the case, Advocacy groups highlighted the importance of cold case units and forensic advancements. Neighbors who had lived near the Turner property remembered how the tragedy reshaped their sense of safety and trust, and Justin's surviving relatives honored his memory through their persistence and unwavering belief that the truth would one day emerge. Even now, more than 3 decades after the tragedy, the pursuit of justice for Justin continues through the legal system. For investigators, the case remains a reminder of how perseverance, scientific progress, and the dedication of family members can revive even the coldest files. For Justin's loved ones, the case is a testament to a mother's fight, a cousin's commitment, and a community's memory of a little boy whose life deserved so much more. Even now, more than 3 decades after the tragedy, the pursuit of justice for Justin continues through the legal system. For investigators, the case remains a reminder of how perseverance, scientific progress, and the dedication of family members can revive even the coldest files. For Justin's loved ones, the case is a testament to a mother's fight, a cousin's commitment, and a community's memory of a little boy whose life deserved so much more. The years that followed the breakthrough in the case did not bring instant resolution. Instead, they introduced a new chapter, one defined by legal complexities, motions, hearings, and the slow, grinding movement of the justice system as the accused prepared to challenge the evidence assembled against him. For many, it was as if time slowed again, mirroring the long period in which the case had been cold. But this time, there was momentum, and no one involved intended to let the case slip back into silence. When the case transitioned from investigation to prosecution, the mood in the community shifted. People who had followed the story for years finally felt a renewed sense of hope. News reports revisited the tragedy, reminding viewers of the shocking day in 1989 and the profound loss that had fractured a family. Journalists traced the story from the initial disappearance to the discovery of the body, through the early frustrations, and finally into the resurgence brought by forensic science. As the accused was brought into court for preliminary hearings, cameras captured a man who had long lived his life assuming the past was buried. His arrival in an orange jumpsuit, hands bound, surrounded by officers, symbolized a moment many believed they would never see. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was heavy. Families of both the victim and the accused attended, though they remained separated. Justin's mother, older now but still carrying the weight of the tragedy in her eyes, sat quietly among relatives and supporters. Her presence communicated something that words could never fully express: grief that had matured into endurance, sorrow that had aged into strength. Members of the accused family also watched, some stunned, some defensive, some still struggling to understand how a relative they had known for so long could be implicated in something so horrific. It was a moment where two families, connected only by a tragedy that neither wanted, found themselves on opposite sides of the same courtroom. The prosecutors presented the foundation of their case, explaining how modern DNA analysis had revealed critical information that was previously inaccessible. They detailed how earlier tests had yielded only inconclusive results, limited by the tools of the time, but how new techniques allowed forensic teams to extract profiles from degraded samples. They explained to the court how each advancement had brought them closer to identifying the individual responsible. Their summary was meticulous, built around scientific credibility and a persistent timeline of investigative work that ultimately pointed toward the accused. These opening steps were not about proving guilt, that would come later, but about demonstrating that the evidence was strong enough to proceed to trial. The defense sought to challenge the reliability of the forensic methods, arguing that time, contamination, and environmental exposure could compromise samples. They criticized the chain of custody from the 1980s, pointing out inconsistencies or gaps that might raise doubts about whether the biological materials had been preserved properly. They questioned whether the new forensic tests, despite being technologically advanced, might produce misleading or overstated conclusions when applied to decades-old evidence. Their strategy was clear: undermine confidence in the science, highlight uncertainty, and introduce the possibility of reasonable doubt long before a jury was ever seated. During these pre-trial proceedings, experts testified on both sides. Forensic scientists described the specific testing processes in detail, from extraction to amplification to comparison. They emphasized that modern techniques were designed to analyze even small, compromised samples without compromising accuracy. They reaffirmed that the genetic material matched the accused and that their findings had been peer-reviewed, cross-checked, and validated by multiple analysts. The defense cross-examined them thoroughly, pressing on technical points and highlighting the complexity of forensic DNA interpretation. They aimed to convince the court that science, while powerful, was not infallible. Spectators listened as the arguments unfolded, realizing that science alone would not resolve the case. The emotional weight of Justin's story was undeniable, but the courtroom required more than emotion. Every detail, from scientific procedure to investigative interviews to physical evidence, had to withstand scrutiny. This reality frustrated some who attended the hearings, especially those who had lived with the memory of the tragedy for so long. They felt that justice had already been delayed for decades, and now it seemed to be slowed down by legal maneuvering. Yet those familiar with the legal system understood that such processes, while tedious, were essential. A case of this magnitude demanded thoroughness. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited for every update. Footage of the accused being transported to and from hearings circulated daily, igniting public debates. Some members of the community expressed confidence in the forensic breakthroughs, believing they finally identified the person responsible. Others cautioned against jumping to conclusions, worrying that the case might rely too heavily on scientific interpretation rather than comprehensive evidence. Still, most agreed that the renewed attention was necessary because after so many years of silence, the story needed to be told again, not only for Justin's sake, but for the sake of justice. As the legal proceedings continued, investigators revisited earlier witness statements and re-examined physical evidence from storage. They re-interviewed individuals who had been in the boy's life or present in the neighborhood around the time of his disappearance. Some memories had faded with time, while others had remained hauntingly vivid. People who had once been young children themselves were now adults with children of their own, reflecting on how the tragedy had shaped their sense of safety growing up. Some recalled rumors or suspicions from the time, while others remembered interactions they once dismissed as insignificant. These renewed interviews offered prosecutors context but rarely provided groundbreaking revelations. Still, they helped reinforce the timeline and behavior patterns relevant to the case. Defense investigators conducted their own inquiries, searching for any inconsistency that could weaken the prosecution's narrative. They combed through reports, tracked down alternative theories, and attempted to identify any individuals who might have had opportunity or motive. Their approach was not about finding the truth in a moral sense. It was about building a case that could protect their client from conviction by emphasizing doubt. This dual investigative effort, prosecution and defense moving simultaneously, brought a new dimension to a case that had once felt frozen in time. Meanwhile, Justin's family continued their quiet advocacy. They attended every hearing, no matter how minor, refusing to let the memory of the boy be overshadowed by legal technicalities. Their presence served as a reminder of what the case was truly about, not just forensic reports or legal strategy, but the life of a child who had once run through the neighborhood with innocence and trust. At one hearing, a relative brought a small photograph of Justin, worn at the edges from being handled for years. It rested in her hands as she sat through the proceedings, a silent tribute to the boy who had brought them all there. Community support also began to grow once again. People who had watched the story unfold decades earlier reached out to the family, sending letters of encouragement or attending court sessions. Local groups organized small gatherings and vigils honoring Justin's memory and expressing hope for accountability. For some, this resurgence of solidarity was healing. For others, it reopened old wounds. Still, it reinforced that the child's life had left an imprint that time could not erase. Media coverage expanded beyond the local area as interest in cold case breakthroughs grew across the nation. Documentaries, podcasts, and investigative programs began contacting the family and law enforcement, seeking to tell the story with depth and nuance. Many were drawn to the case not only because of the tragedy itself, but because it represented something universal, hope that justice, even delayed, could still be achieved. However, the family remained cautious. They chose to participate selectively, prioritizing outlets that treated the story with the sensitivity it deserved. As the preliminary phases continued, one of the most emotional moments occurred when the prosecution read aloud portions of the original case file, describing the search efforts, the discovery of the body, and the devastating confirmation that followed. Even after so many years, hearing those details in a courtroom was overwhelming for many in attendance. Justin's mother wiped her eyes while sitting upright, holding her composure with remarkable strength. Her presence alone reminded everyone of the human cost behind the legal proceedings, grounding the case beyond scientific or procedural detachment. The accused showed little outward emotion during these moments, though observers debated what his demeanor meant. Some claimed he appeared indifferent, while others argued he looked anxious or distant, possibly overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation. Defense attorneys advised him not to respond to outbursts or emotional moments in the courtroom, instructing him to maintain composure to avoid influencing public perception. His reactions, or lack thereof, became a topic of discussion among journalists covering the case. In the months leading up to trial, both sides filed a series of motions. The defense attempted to exclude certain evidence, particularly the forensic material that had become central to the case. They argued that its age made it unreliable and that storage conditions over decades might have compromised its integrity. Prosecutors countered by presenting documentation of proper handling and storage, as well as expert testimony affirming that the biological evidence remained suitable for testing. The judge weighed each argument carefully, aware that the decisions made at this stage could shape the direction of the entire trial. While the legal teams prepared, the community continued to reflect on the tragedy. Teachers from the school Justin once attended shared memories with local media, describing a bright and gentle boy whose absence had left a void. Former classmates, now adults, recounted how the news had affected them as children. Some remembered being afraid to walk alone for months afterward. Others remembered parents who became more protective, altering routines and reinforcing boundaries. The tragedy had influenced an entire generation's sense of security, and its resurgence brought those memories back into focus. As time passed, the case also sparked broader conversations about how missing children investigations had evolved since the 1980s. Experts in child safety highlighted improvements in rapid response protocols, interagency communication, and forensic capabilities. Many emphasized that while the system was far from perfect, the challenges faced by investigators in 1989 were far greater than those today. These discussions, though painful, served as a reminder of how past tragedies had shaped present-day practices. When the final pre-trial hearing concluded, the judge ruled that the case would proceed to trial with the key evidence intact. The courtroom was silent as the decision was read, punctuated only by the quiet reactions of those in attendance. For Justin's family, it was another step toward a long-awaited day in court. For the accused, it marked the beginning of a legal battle that would test every aspect of the evidence presented against him. For the community, it symbolized a commitment to accountability that had endured despite the passage of time. As trial preparations intensified, attorneys reviewed every detail of the case. Prosecutors built a narrative centered on the forensic evidence, the circumstances of the child's disappearance, and the behaviors exhibited by the accused. They analyzed timelines, revisited testimonies, and refined their arguments. Their goal was to present a clear, compelling, and scientifically supported account of what had happened to Justin that day. They understood that the burden of proof in a case this old required a precise and methodical approach. The defense, meanwhile, sought to craft an alternative interpretation. They emphasized that forensic evidence, while powerful, could be misapplied or misunderstood. They questioned the reliability of memories after decades had passed and highlighted the absence of certain forms of corroborating evidence. Their strategy was rooted in the principle that the prosecution must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, a high standard, especially in a case complicated by time. As the trial date approached, anticipation grew. Reporters prepared for extensive coverage. True crime enthusiasts followed updates closely. Community members took time off work to attend proceedings. And through it all, Justin's family remained steadfast, knowing that the coming weeks would be emotionally taxing but necessary. They had waited more than 30 years for this moment, and they were ready to face whatever came next. On the morning the trial finally began, the courthouse was surrounded by media vans, reporters setting up equipment, and spectators gathering early. Inside, the air was tense but purposeful. Jurors were selected, instructed carefully on their duties, and sworn in. Everyone knew the significance of what they were about to hear, evidence from the past brought forward to define the present. and as opening statements began, each word carried the weight of a story that had stretched across generations, a case defined by loss, persistence, science, and the relentless pursuit of truth. As opening statements began, each word carried the weight of a story that had stretched across generations, a case defined by loss, persistence, science, and the relentless pursuit of truth. The prosecution started first, laying out a timeline that connected the events of 1989 to the present courtroom. They described the final day Justin was seen alive, the search that followed, and the devastating discovery that shattered a family and a community. The prosecutor spoke carefully, balancing the emotional gravity of the case with the necessity for factual clarity. He described the strides in forensic science that made this trial possible, emphasizing that the evidence had not changed. The science had finally caught up to it. Jurors listened intently, many taking notes as the prosecution walked them through the events with deliberate precision. They were reminded that this was not just a case of forensic breakthroughs, it was a case about a child who trusted, a child who should have been safe, and a child whose life had been cut short in an act of violence that still echoed decades later. Yet the prosecution made clear that the case was not about sympathy, it was about evidence, about genetic material that had remained the same since the moment the crime was committed, waiting for technology to reveal what investigators could not. When the defense rose for their opening statement, their tone was markedly different. They cautioned the jury against being swayed by emotion, reminding them that tragedy alone does not constitute proof. They argued that time complicates truth, that memories fade, that evidence stored for decades is subject to degradation, and that modern forensic techniques, while impressive, are not exempt from error. They underscored that their client was presumed innocent, and that the burden lay entirely with the state to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Their message was simple: science may advance, but it is still interpreted by humans, and humans can be wrong. And with opening statements complete, the trial shifted into testimony. The prosecution began by calling the original investigators from 1989, now retired or near retirement. Some had gray hair, others spoke slowly with the weight of years etched into their voices. They recounted the early search efforts, the frantic hours of tracking leads, the nights spent combing through wooded areas, and the overwhelming heartbreak when the boy's body was discovered. Many paused as they described those moments, their voices catching slightly. Even after all this time, the pain of that day lingered, but they remained composed, focused on providing the jury with a clear understanding of the facts. Next came the forensic experts. They explained each step taken to analyze the biological evidence, detailing how modern DNA amplification techniques worked on old samples. They described the process with scientific precision, using terminology that the court needed them to break down into plain language. The prosecutor guided them carefully, ensuring the jury understood each concept without becoming lost in technical jargon. Charts and visual aids displayed genetic profiles, emphasizing the match between the accused and the evidence found at the crime scene. The experts testified confidently, noting that the probability of the DNA belonging to someone else was astronomically low. The defense cross-examined assertively. They questioned the experts about contamination risks, storage conditions, and whether alternative interpretations were possible. They challenged the chain of custody from 1989, hoping to raise doubts about whether the samples tested in the present day were indeed the same as those originally collected. They asked about degradation, about the limitations of technology at the time, and about whether false positives could occur. Each challenge forced the experts to clarify and defend their methodology, reinforcing the rigor of their work and the reliability of their conclusions. As the scientific testimony unfolded, the courtroom grew increasingly silent. The jurors watched closely, absorbing each detail. Some leaned forward, trying to understand the nuances of genetic markers and probability ratios. Others remained still, listening without expression. The accused sat quietly beside his attorneys, occasionally glancing toward the images displayed on monitors but rarely reacting. His face remained largely unreadable, a point that journalists would later highlight in their coverage. After the forensic phase of the trial, the prosecution shifted its focus to behavioral evidence. They introduced interviews conducted over the years, statements made by the accused, and accounts from individuals who had interacted with him around the time of the crime. Several neighbors and acquaintances testified about his presence in the area, his relationship with children in the community, and certain behaviors they had observed. None of these testimonies alone were damning, but together they formed a backdrop, a picture of opportunity, familiarity, and proximity. Some witnesses struggled with their recollections, acknowledging that decades had passed since the events they were describing. The prosecution anticipated this and guided them gently, allowing them to speak in their own words without pushing for more detail than they could confidently offer. Still, even fragmented memories retained weight. One witness described seeing the accused near a wooded area on the day Justin disappeared, though she had never thought much of it at the time. Another recalled the accused being unusually tense in the days that followed the tragedy, avoiding eye contact and retreating from conversations. The defense countered by emphasizing the unreliability of memories after so many years. They argued that people often reconstruct events subconsciously, influenced by news coverage or community discussions. They pointed out inconsistencies between the current testimonies and the statements recorded decades earlier. Their strategy was to dismantle the relevance of these recollections, leaving the forensic evidence standing alone with no contextual support. When it was time for Justin's mother to testify, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. She walked to the witness stand slowly but with a determined posture. Her voice was calm, steady, but her eyes carried the sorrow of a lifetime. She described her son, not the tragedy, but the child he had been. She spoke of his laughter, his curiosity, his gentle nature. She recounted the day he went missing, the search, and the moment she received the news that would forever divide her life into before and after. Her testimony was not about identifying the accused, it was about the impact of the crime, the irreplaceable loss that had shaped her existence. The defense declined to cross-examine her. It would have been both tactically unwise and ethically questionable to challenge a grieving mother about the death of her child. Her words were allowed to stand on their own. A reminder to everyone in the room of the human cost of the case. As the trial progressed, the judge maintained strict oversight, ensuring that procedural rules were followed and that the jury received clear instructions. He reminded them repeatedly that emotion, while understandable, must not influence their verdict. He encouraged them to rely on evidence, analysis, and law. His presence brought structure to a case laden with memory, pain, and decades of community emotion. After weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, expert analyses, and narrative building, the prosecution rested. The defense then began presenting its own witnesses. They called additional forensic consultants to critique the state's methodology, emphasizing that trace evidence from decades earlier could be compromised. They highlighted alternative explanations, including the possibility of secondary transfer or accidental contamination. They brought forward acquaintances of the accused who described him as calm, gentle, and incapable of harming a child. These character witnesses spoke sincerely, though the prosecution later pointed out that no one truly knows the private actions of another. The defense also scrutinized investigative decisions from the original case, pointing out that early leads had been abandoned, suspects were not thoroughly vetted, and some interviews were incomplete. They argued that these gaps left room for alternative theories, including the possibility of another perpetrator who had never been identified. Their goal was not necessarily to prove someone else committed the crime, but to reinforce uncertainty, enough uncertainty to prevent a conviction. As the defense concluded its presentation, the courtroom felt a deep shift. After decades of silence, years of renewed investigation, and weeks of intense testimony, the case was finally nearing the moment where a jury would determine its outcome. Both sides prepared for closing arguments, aware that their words would be the final impression left before deliberations began. The prosecution delivered a concise yet impactful closing. They revisited the timeline of Justin's disappearance, the discovery of the evidence, the forensic breakthroughs, and the consistent match to the accused. They acknowledged the passage of time, but emphasized that the truth had not changed. They reminded the jury that DNA does not degrade into coincidence. It points clearly and unequivocally to the individual from whom it originated. They asked the jury to consider not only the science but the totality of the case, the opportunity, the proximity, the behavior patterns, and the forensic findings. Their message was firm. Justice, though delayed, was now within reach. The defense countered by highlighting doubt, reasonable doubt, the standard that must be met for conviction. They argued that the prosecution's case relied too heavily on old evidence and modern interpretation. They insisted that the jury must consider what was missing: no eyewitness account, placing the accused at the exact scene, no confession, no physical evidence beyond the DNA that could have been compromised over time. They urged jurors not to let emotion override logic, reminding them that a verdict must be based on certainty, not sympathy. With closing arguments complete, the judge instructed the jury carefully. He reminded them of the weight of their responsibility, the importance of impartiality, and the necessity of basing their decisions solely on the evidence presented. He dismissed them to begin deliberations, and the courtroom slowly emptied, leaving families, reporters, attorneys, and spectators waiting for a verdict that could take hours, days, or even longer. Deliberations stretched on, the jury poring over evidence, transcripts, and forensic reports. They requested clarifications, reviewed expert testimony, and debated the strength of the DNA findings. The courthouse remained tense throughout, with people gathering in hallways, cafeterias, and outside on the steps. Reporters prepared segments that could shift with a moment's notice, and court officers kept a close watch on the growing crowd. After significant deliberation, the jury announced that they had reached a decision. Word spread quickly, drawing people back into the courthouse. The families returned to their seats, their faces tense but composed. The accused walked in with the same unreadable expression he had worn throughout the trial, though his hands trembled slightly as he sat down. When the jury filed in, the silence became absolute. The foreperson stood, holding a sheet of paper that represented decades of waiting. The verdict was read slowly, clearly, each word slicing through the heavy air. For one family, the decision brought a mixture of relief, sorrow, and closure. For the other, it brought disbelief, devastation, and the beginning of a new kind of struggle. The courtroom reacted quietly at first, but the emotions simmering beneath the surface soon became visible among the families. The trial concluded, but the story did not end there. Appeals would follow, questions would linger, and discussions about justice, evidence, and the passage of time would continue. Yet for the community, the verdict marked the end of a chapter they had lived through for more than 30 years. It symbolized not only a pursuit of truth, but the resilience of a family that had refused to let the memory of a child fade into silence. In the years that followed, the case became a reference point in discussions about cold cases and forensic advancements. It demonstrated how scientific progress could breathe life into old evidence, how persistence from families could keep cases alive, and how communities could come together to support one another through unthinkable tragedy. Justin's story became part of a broader narrative, one that acknowledged loss, honored memory, and affirmed that no matter how much time passes, truth remains worth seeking. And through every anniversary, every court date, and every new development, Justin's family continued to carry his memory forward. They spoke about him not as a victim, but as a child filled with promise, a child who deserved safety, love, and a full life. Their voices ensured that he would never be reduced to a case number or a forensic file. He remained a little boy whose life touched many, whose story shifted an entire community, and whose legacy continued to push the boundaries of justice long after he was gone. As we conclude this documentary on Silent Witness Archive, we encourage you to support the channel so these stories can continue to be told. Please remember to like this video, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button so you never miss future investigations brought back into the light.